welcome to everybody who has made it here with us. I'm Ruth Meinzendick. I'm a senior research fellow at International Food Policy Research Institute, and I'm the leader of the work package on governance in the NEXUS Gains. Today, we're going to be talking about some work on tools for groundwater governance. I have the distinct privilege of working with and sharing the podium, so to speak, today with Brian Bruns, an independent researcher and consultant who has been working on water governance for decades and a great deal of transdisciplinary experience in this. And Ritu Sanil from Foundation for Ecological Security, who has also been working with us very closely on various aspects of water governance. Ritu has kindly stepped in to substitute for his colleague Pratiti Priyadarshini, who is caught in traffic in India. So without further ado, let me get started and I am not, are you seeing my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
We're still seeing you.
Okay.
Okay. Started.
Now, are you?
Yes.
And
yeah. You just need to go to the first slide.
Okay, great. There. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks. Okay. So thank you all. And so in work package 4, we are working to strengthen cross-sectoral multi-stakeholder governance. And that's supporting policymakers and a whole range of other stakeholders. With one aspect of that is on multi-stakeholder platforms to address this nexus of water, energy, food, and ecosystems. But what I'm going to be talking about today is the co-development of a groundwater governance toolbox to address the growing competition, degradation, and depletion of resources in particular hotspots. So not everywhere. Now, why does this matter? Well, I've been conscious of the problems with groundwater depletion ever since I was a kid growing up in Tamil Nadu in India. That's a picture from behind where I lived. And when pump sets became available and farmers started putting in bananas and such in an area that was quite semi-arid, the water table started falling and the drinking water wells that people had relied on, including our household, started going dry. So I've been aware of this as a problem for many years. And this got me into actually looking a lot at water and water as a commons. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, it's a shared resource. One person's use reduces what's available for others. That's part of the classic definition of a common pool resource. The other part is that it's really hard to exclude people. It's really hard to establish boundaries on water resources. And there's a lot of dispersed users in many cases. The additional challenges of groundwater are that it's a fugitive resource. It's even harder than surface water to see where it goes and to really understand the dynamics. It's got low visibility. And even in places like South India, where people have a lot of sophisticated and understanding of surface water resources, there's even a lot of hydrologists have limited understanding of the resource dynamics in groundwater. It's really hard to identify the aquifer boundaries, so traditional knowledge is often insufficient, especially with rapidly developing pumping technology. We've also had years and years of experience to say that state regulation is often not enough, because the state often just doesn't have the capacity to enforce the regulations that may be passed. So we really, all of this is to say that as we get problems with depletion or contamination, or in some cases, rising water tables, there is a need for governance to manage the resource. Now, I focused for many years on surface water because groundwater seemed just too difficult a nut to crack because of all those additional challenges. But one of the first things that encouraged me that something could be done was work with Foundation for Ecological Security, or FES, we started to apply experimental games that were used in a lot of studies of common pool resources, to use them as an experiential learning for communities, to see whether that could help them to understand their connection to the resource and to each other, and use that as an entry point for stimulating groundwater governance. Our experience on this with FES was very encouraging, because it was helping people go beyond just regulating, attempting to regulate, or instructing people and telling them what they should be doing, to actually a social learning, which was affecting their mental models, the way they see the world, and their motivations. Now, this was through a process of these games and then community debriefing that helped them to start to say what they might do. Now, this was operating in particular contexts. They were hard rock aquifers in India, where localized collective action could have an effect. We did start to see effects of both groundwater and surface water games. And for example, that communities with the games were significantly more likely to adopt groundwater or water registers and rules about groundwater, and some effect on people's attitudes. So from these pilots, the FES had expanded this to 214 habitations, and a lot of farmers adopted less water consumptive crops. Then we've been taking this to scale now. We're attempting to roll out this package of experiential learning to 2,500 communities in India via FES and 6 other partner organizations. And we've been taking this from India to Ethiopia and Ghana with adaptations and such. Now, if we look broadly at groundwater levels are, in my simplified mental model, an outcome of groundwater recharge and groundwater use. The groundwater recharge, though, can be affected by rainfall, certainly, but also watershed management activities and the maintenance of structures that capture that rainfall and can increase groundwater recharge. The groundwater use, a lot of the emphasis has been on government policies, as I mentioned, which haven't been always effective. Also on on output and energy prices, which can affect groundwater use. But we also wanted to look at the scope for community rules, community understanding, and that's where the games and these other tools come in. Now, this approach of the community-based work won't work everywhere. You'll hear more from Richu about how they've combined the games with other tools. So we are scaling up these activities in India, and stay tuned. We'll hopefully have another webinar about the impact on that. With Nexus Gains, though, work package 4, Nexus Gains is working in 4 basins with very diverse geographies: hard rock, alluvial, arid, and arid to humid, the whole. So we wanted to look more broadly at what tools are available for groundwater governance, under what conditions have they been tried, and with what outcomes. Now, we know that there is not one panacea, no silver bullet, whatever analogy you want to use, that will work everywhere. But one of our questions is, how can this social learning interventions, like behavioral games, but other kinds of things, be combined with technical and policy measures, and to develop inclusive groundwater governance systems? So in order to help address that question, I turned to Brian Bruns to work with us on that. And so without further ado, I will turn this over to Brian to talk about what we have found in developing a toolbox. Brian?
Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction. So again, I'll be saying a bit more about combining and crafting institutional tools for groundwater governance. And as Ruth was mentioning, this starts from this example of these groundwater games, which you can see in the picture here. We have staff from FES and farmers sitting there trying to decide, okay, which stimulated crop do I want to grow? And up on the wall, posters helping them see, okay, how much water does it take? How much crop do I get? What happens to the groundwater level? And this question of this is an example of a tool, how that works to perhaps change their behavior, their mental models. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to first quickly just go through the kind of highlights as that part of what looking around at the literature and reviewing experience, there are lots of different tools. However, as Ruth was mentioning, there's no panacea, no tool that works everywhere, and rather different from like irrigation surface water. With groundwater, there are actually not that many successes, and so eliminating the extent of the challenge. However, these groundwater games, as we just heard, seem in some conditions to be able to make a difference. In terms of what context to work on this, that co-management, that, well, I guess the bigger finding first that state-led groundwater governance in many cases is not working very well. And instead looks more promising to work in co-management situations where you can combine the stakeholders, knowledge, values, and collective action, but not just that, but to have that working together with hydrogeology, external science, and resources and authority. And to say in a kind of eclectic approach, people can do a lot starting from their own experience and knowledge, and then the kind of conversations and multi-stakeholder processes and such, examples, stories, many sources of learning, including the potential for participatory scenario analysis and things like that. And the kind of thesis, we're saying that the potential gains in these nexus combinations can come from figuring out how to combine and craft solutions that fit context. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this comes from work by EMI, by Francois Mull and Alvaro Closas and colleagues, who kind of looked looked at the whole range of tools, particularly in the context of groundwater overexploitation, and identified, and particularly their synthesis report goes into a fair amount of detail of looking at different tools and why and how they could work to be constructive, and unfortunately very often why and how they're not working. Some of which at first looks like, okay, administrative capacity, technical capacity, but as you look further, a lot of it comes back to politics and political economy and the huge challenges involved in getting enough consensus and support to put in place effective measures and turning that around, the difference that can be there when you do have stakeholders involved and understanding, accepting, and a degree of consensus on the need to change. Okay, I think I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, and this is a way of just kind of looking at, okay, there's not a single toolbox, but different toolboxes, horses for courses, kind of thing. And to put this in a bit of a narrative, to say in many places with traditional shallow wells, communities did have rules, which often worked reasonably well, often in terms of things like well spacing and protection zones to preserve water quality. However, with the advent of tube wells and mechanized pumps, often, and much bigger groundwater withdrawals, those often didn't work very well. The conventional response was to put in this package that seems to make sense. Okay, we're going to require licenses, meters, report how much water you've pumped, and either there or as the next step to impose volumetric quotas. That turns out to be much easier said than done. And again, this review of experience that Mullen Closis and colleagues did to say we see many, many places where that's not working very well. And in a sense, the need to recognize that and step back and think about, okay, what might be done differently? One interesting example was from Andhra Pradesh in India, and very much an information-based and voluntaristic approach, which did some neat stuff during the project and offers some lessons, but also suggests that information alone and this kind of voluntary bringing people together was not sufficient by itself unless backed by some degree of authority and sanctions, and also was not sustainable if outside support didn't continue. We have heard and will hear more of the example of FES, of some of the things they've been doing, building on their previous experience with community forestry and other activities. And then, as some of you are aware, and what the first of these Nexus Gains talks, we heard some from Shilt Verma of cases in India where, again, the regulatory approach was not working well. The simple idea of, okay, well, we'll have a price and that will influence people, also was basically politically impossible and disastrous for people who tried it. So they stepped back and said, what can we do differently? And looked at what could be done with the electric infrastructure. And now interesting experiments if farmers have the opportunity to sell power to the grid. So again, coming up with a different kind of toolbox, including in many cases, this groundwater recharge through watershed conservation. And then in our workshop, which we had just last Monday and Thursday before that, another examples was from North China, synthesizing experience over decades of what can work, even in a place with known as kind of top-down, a lot of state control and a fair amount of government capacity. Again, not so simple, but over time evolving a toolbox. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is another, in terms of thinking about these tools and understanding better when and how they can work and how they can combine. This is another way of slicing up different kinds of tools, the kind of classic distinction of regulatory and financial economic tools on the one hand, and then thinking about information, and then drawing on particularly Henry Howlett and work in policy design to say what sometimes gets forgotten is what government may be able to do by acting directly, or if we broaden out from just government to governance, to think about what other organizations can do in terms of setting up organizations and providing services. And in addition to these substantive tools, procedural tools. And that, in a sense, is where, again, the games come in. What are processes through which people can work together? And we'll hear more also about the crop water budgeting with FES and things like multi-stakeholder processes, which is also part of Work Package 4. So these are another way of slicing tools, and then to think in terms of time and space. These tools, some of them work better in small, close-knit communities where people know each other and expect to be interacting, but that's not the only context in which it's important to manage groundwater. And so building on some earlier work by Ruth, thinking about what happens as you either stand over broader areas in space and need to think about federations and government agencies become more important, and over time, and as different kinds of institutions for property rights and agreements become important. And this slide is very much something in process, but we can go into it in Q&A if people are interested. Next. Okay, and to finish up here and come back again to the Nexus, what we're trying to work on, we've kind of identified what seem to be 3 particularly interesting and important sets of linkages where to think about, okay, again, how to put together toolboxes that fit the situation. The question of solar-powered irrigation, which offers opportunities for farmers and for climate in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, but risks accelerating depletion, and the question of what are pathways and what are combinations of other tools that can help to control those risks and to equitably and sustainably share the available groundwater in ways that are inclusive and contribute to productive use of groundwater. A second type of question concerns thinking about storage, and again, in NEXUS Gains, the work on storage, and that groundwater in many cases can be a cheap and accessible option for storage. But what thinking about in terms of government tools highlights is the need to think about, okay, we can put water into the aquifer, who's going to take it out? Who gets access to that? How to make sure it's available in the context of increasing drought with climate change and other challenges. And then the third and last point here is the opportunities to more explicitly think about ecosystems and environmental flows and groundwater dependent ecosystems as part of groundwater governance, and what that means for where and how you monitor groundwater use, and both areas of intensive use, what may be done to restore ecosystems, and in areas where intensive groundwater use is more incipient, like in East Africa, okay, how to at least understand the potential trade-offs or synergies or strategies that can better manage for multiple values, and to think more broadly about different pathways for agricultural development and the kind of livelihoods people want and what can be done. And I think I'll stop here and pass it on to Ritu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Ritu, you want
to
go ahead?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So I'll be talking about some of the reflection from using some of the tools that Brian and Ruth had talked about. So my perspective will be coming from a practitioner's point of view on how some of these rules are being implemented, some of these tools are being implemented. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So the first tool is the groundwater game. So as Ruth had already talked about it in the beginning, so it is coming from a game theory perspective. It is built, theoretical foundations are in the game theory. So in the groundwater game, so what we essentially do is that we play this game with a group of farmers who depend on groundwater for irrigation. And the farmers are given 2 choices. One is a crop, water intensive crop that fetches them a high returns in the market. And the other is a water efficient crop that may not yield that much of profit as the water efficient, water intensive crop. So, so in each year, the farmers are given this choice and they choose a crop, and based on that, the water level, water that is available to the farmer may change. So that is how the game is carried out. And so the idea is that the game fosters this thinking that water use as well as the agriculture systems are linked. So that is the main idea that the game is trying to foster. And also when you think about it that way, that water as a shared resource, and if the farmers will get the perspective that if I use more water, then my neighbors may get less water. And if my neighbors use more water, I may get less water. So the games are a way to start that discussion around water in a community and how water and other systems are linked. And usually water games are followed by a debriefing session. So in the debriefing session, the facilitator will reflect with the players as well as the larger community who came to see the games on what are some of the insights of the game and how that insights are tied to some of the local water governance issues in the village. Yeah, next slide. So the next tool is crop water budgeting. So again, crop water budgeting usually happens after the water games. So it is a participatory tool. It's a participatory tool that helps us to arrive at what is the water available and also juxtapose that information with what is the water requirement in the village based on the existing crop choice. So with this exercise, the community can arrive at a collective understanding of the water available to them. So this helps them make decision about the crop choice. So they so based on the water availability, they can choose the crop they want. So that is crop water budgeting. And the main idea is that the idea of crop choice, it doesn't have to be an individual choice, and it has to come as a collective choice. So this is also important when we think of using water as a shared resource. And how FAS is using this crop water budgeting is that we have used an Android, we have developed an Android app. So in which together with the community, you input certain information and some data is coming from secondary sources. And based on that, the app will give you, as you can see, there is a weighing scale in the picture. So if there is a water deficit in the village, so you can the weighing scale will be on the, you can see it like it will be like that on the image, and if it's a surplus, it will shift to the other side. So this will give the communities on how they should plan their cropping for this a particular season. So that is how crop water budgeting is done. So now can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So along with this gains and crop water budgeting, we are also talking about some sort of capacity building and information sharing on some of the sustainable agriculture practices. For example, variety change in practices using better water efficient irrigation practices. So these are some of the things that is complementing the tools on water gains and crop water budgeting. Next slide. Yeah. So the other important tool is community-based system dynamics. So so this particular tool helps in visualizing what are some of the linkages between the forest, land, farms, water, and the people's institutions, the social institutions that we have. So so once you do this exercise with the community, it helps in understanding what are some of the impact or of your decision in the future resource use. So if you plan to create a pond or a water harvesting structure, and if you look at the upland from where the water is flowing, if there is deforestation happening there, then your structure will get desilted fast, and then the yield that you're getting from the water harvesting structure may be decreasing. So these kind of interconnection between different resource systems, that is something that the community-based system dynamics tool can help to help the communities understand. So this is also complementing our use of gains, crop water budgeting. Yeah, next slide. So, so in the previous slide, the gains and crop water budgeting, we're talking about demand side management. So now here we also have to look at the supply side management, because we need both sides for efficient. We need intervention in both demand and the supply side for water governance. So when you look at planning that is happening for increasing the supply through building new water harvesting structures and everything. So most often it happens, without using local data, without using hydrological data that is already available. For example, in CLART, we use data about land use, land change pattern, on slope, on soil type, on lithology. So all this data is already available. So now the idea is that how we can club all this data and make it available for planning. So CLART exactly does that. So it is also an Android-based application, which aggregates all this information about a particular location, and it gives you some suggestions on how we can plan water governance interventions in it. So as you can see, the suggestions come color coded. So if you look at in the image, if it is a green color code, that means that area is good for water recharge structures. And if it is yellow, then it's a moderately good area for water recharge. And the red areas is not water recharge may not be suitable there. And the violet areas is catchment conservation area, and you can carry out catchment conservation activities in there. So, and also, if you look at, there's a dependence on bureaucrats, engineers who has to do this kind of planning. But what CLART does is that makes it easy for community members to take part in that planning process and can also contribute to that process. So that is another relevance of this CLART tool. Yeah, next slide. So the other thing is that, so when we use a lot of tools and we are talking about a lot of data that can be communicated and how these communities can make informed decisions. So as you can see, a major challenge is that how we can communicate this information in communities where literacy levels are low, when education levels are low. So you have to come up with different innovative tools. So these are some of the pictorial depictions that we use to communicate the information. So for example, as you can see, there's a poster on how the bottled waters and the roti that is there, and the weighing scale that we talked about in the previous one. So these are some of the ways in which we are communicating this thing to the communities. Next slide. Yeah. So as you can see, so over the years, in the past several years, we have been implementing a lot of these tools. And one thing that we have observed is that at the community level, changes are happening, and also the farmer level changes are happening. So the individual level, we are talking about the farmers are changing their crop choices. They're changing their cropping pattern. They're using mixed cropping. They're using water saving techniques. So these things are happening at the individual level in the villages that we have been working with. And the data that you can see is coming from an impact assessment that we did several years back, where we try to see how much water is saved based on the crop water budgeting tool that we use. Yes. Next slide. Yeah. So, so lastly, coming to how the community is responding to some. So this is some of the responses of the communities to these interventions that we are doing. So if you look at it in Rajasthan, which is primarily arid zone, so their communities are responded with banning the construction of borewells and fostering the idea that water is a shared resource and it has to be managed as such. And they have talked about sharing borewells or sharing wells. So these kind of decisions by the community is actually feeding into one of the major policy challenges, how we can de-link land rights and water rights. So this is one of the major challenges that we face in India. And if you look at in South, especially in Andhra and Karnataka, so where they had a traditional Nirugati system, which is a surface tank irrigation that was traditionally being carried out. So that had declined over the years due to various reasons. But now the communities are trying to revive how we can do it. And if you come to Odisha, and especially in Madhya Pradesh and Odisha, which is a forest-dominated landscape, there the communities are talking about traditional fishing rights. And especially there, it's not the groundwater. The main thing is surface water, how we can manage surface water structures, how we can maintain it frequently, all those things. Yes, next slide. And lastly, as I said, like we have been doing water governance intervention for a very long time, and we have tried to compile all our experiences in a water common source book. So this source book is mainly for practitioners where practitioners, where we're trying to lay out some of the principles, approaches, and the tools that we're using for water governance. So this is also available in the public domain. So we can, as you can see, there's a link there, and we'll also share it with all the participants. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's it from my end. Thanks.
Thank you, Richu. And so I see that we have been some chat. Okay, we welcome people to put their questions into the Q&A area, and we will try. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm sorry. At the bottom, if you had questions as you were going along, but
Okay, Ruth, we do
yes.
have some questions which have posted some answers, but if some of those people want to speak up and
great, thank you.
Expand on their questions or comments.
While I was sharing a screen, I wasn't able to see that.
So we have Asadu Zaman was asking about many ministries and such. I don't know whether Asaduz wants to unmute or can be unmuted if you want to say something. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Nexus support, can you unmute participants to ask a question? In the meantime, I'll just say what I posted in the chat, that there's a project with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the FAO that's doing interesting work on water tenure assessment and looking not just at formal law, but customary law and the other relationships with people regarding water, and trying to understand, okay, what's on the books, what's happening in practice. And I think Asaduz is unmuted, so if you would like to go ahead and offer.
Okay. My question that in the developing countries, especially in the developing in Southeast Asia, there are many ministries, many organizations and agencies under those ministries have contradictory law, act, rules, and regulations. So, in the field, the implementing engineers or whoever, not engineers, they feel little confused that, okay, which one should prevail, which law should prevail. That should be first sorted out. Otherwise, there will be always confusion in the field. That's my number one question. Number two is how we can get the copy of these presentations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. That's my.
Okay. Do you want to start, Ruth, or I can say something? Or
sure. Well, just to the last point, because I saw that there's been a number of questions about this. We the whole webinar will be posted, but also we would be very happy to share a copy of the a PDF of the presentation itself, which will also have the link to the source book. And if Richu or I can get our act together, we can post the link to the source book also in the Q&A area so that anybody can pick that up. Brian, do you want to take the more substantive question?
Okay, yeah, and this challenge of multiple laws and agencies is crucial and important, but I think I'm going to take a different approach, and it's not as if there's going to be some decree on high and says this is the only one that matters. And instead, what's actually more interesting and important, and Richu may say more, is within a particular context, whether this is within a basin, an irrigation system, one community, a set of surrounding communities, to have a process of bringing stakeholders together and thinking about what matters to them and the legal context is important, but not fixating on one particular law. Even if the law, you can point to a law that says the overlying landowner has the right to take as much as water as they want. Wait a minute, there are other principles, including, we can go way back in the law, public trust doctrine, human rights to water. Often in the statutes, there recognition of subsistence needs or a right to thirst, multiple principles that communities may assert their sovereignty and say, wait a minute, this is something we're sharing. And FES has approached this in terms of ideas about commoning. So a process where people discuss, share their values, and get a better understanding from local and scientific knowledge of the resource and what can be done with it, and then come together of, okay, how do we make sense of this? But Ritu, if you want to maybe say more about commenting and such.
Yeah, so for example, if you look at in India, we have this, as I said, in Roots Meal, this the water and the land. If you are on a piece of land, the water under it, you can withdraw it as much as you want. And there is also this colonial local Indian Easement Act, according to which it says like that. But if you look at in Rajasthan and all, where we have been trying to foster this kind of thinking and water as a common resource, the communities came up and said, no, we can't have more bore wells in our community. So we need to put an end to it. So there was, protest by communities on when somebody tried to bring a bore well. So these kind of things are also happening. So this is even if in the existing legal and policy framework, the communities are also trying to come up and do, trying to share the natural resources in their own way. So there is also a space for that, which is there. Yeah.
Good. And I see we have a couple of other good questions. Let's take Els Lecoutres. Do you want to be unmuted and ask that, or shall we just read it out?
You can just read it out.
Okay, sure.
I'm okay, thanks.
Well, you're unmuted, so go ahead.
Yeah,
it's nice to hear a different voice.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, when resources are scarce, like this groundwater, and there are probably different uses of this water, not only irrigation, not only crop production, but even domestic use. So then power relations that are linked to maybe your gender or which caste or which ethnicity you belong to, which livelihood you have. So how is that addressed in the games? How is that managed? And in the other solutions that you had, I think the question is particularly for Ritu and FES. Thank you.
Yeah, Ritu, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, sure. So when you talk about water use in a village, so if you look at 80% of the water that is used is mainly for irrigation, and the remaining very few water is used for like livestock use or drinking water use. So that is why since the predominant share of water that is being used is for irrigation, that is why we are focusing on water and agriculture linkage. And the other aspect on how we are looking into the power relation within the village, maybe because of the caste and class and land ownership and all that. So for the water games, when we talk about it as a community activity, so how we envision it is that it is also a public sphere where you can discuss on water. So in this water game, so the participants who will play the game. And so we are inviting people from diverse backgrounds, people from different caste groups, different landowning classes. We are also playing it with men and women separately. So this is also from our understanding that the resource use by men or the perspective of how women and men perceive water is different. So we are trying to incorporate all these things into our activity, and that is how we are rolling out this intervention.
Yeah. If I can just pick up from that on two levels. One is in the games. The first time we piloted them, we found some strange results on how women played versus men, and we realized that part of it was that we were not including the drinking water aspect, and so which women were particularly concerned about, but that was being excluded from the game. So we readapted that to build that in, and we do make explicit effort to make sure that women as well as men are participating in the games and in the debriefing. Now, but Elsa's question raises a much bigger point as well about the importance of power relations. So Brian mentioned that we've just had a workshop on groundwater governance with about 60 or so people last week and this week, a couple of sessions. And one of the important points that was raised is that you can't ignore the political economy and even explicitly the politics of this, because in a lot of cases, in a lot of cases, if you don't have the support of really powerful actors, it won't go anywhere. And so you do need to take that into account. There were examples of where highlighting the effect of irrigation use on other members of the community was influential in getting some action, but not always. And it depends on how polarized things are and how separate they are, which is again why Brian alluded to this issue of multi-stakeholder platforms. Can you bring these different interest groups and actors together to discuss this and be part of the planning process to get their buy-in? I see there's a discussion going on between Claudia Ringler and Matthew McCartney. I think one of the, and I'll just pick up, I think Matthew is answering, but I think one of the big issues is with any of the technologies or information types of things that are being used, what is the capacity of people to use that, and do they understand the implications of it? Which I'll take that opportunity to talk about some of the challenges we faced in the work with FES of really scaling. You can do intensive capacity building in a few communities. How can you do that at larger scale is also really important. One of the things FES has been doing, the avenue, is to use community resource persons. These are people, para-workers, if you will, from the community who may not, in many cases, do not have advanced education, but they get some training, and then they can either implement the games or these various CLART and other technologies, and making it simple enough, making the apps simple enough that they can use them, has been a really important way of doing this at scale. I don't know if Claudia or Matthew would want to come in about the examples of water savings from Ethiopia.
This is Matthew.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, the work that I saw seemed quite convincing. I guess, yeah, I mean, I don't know the detail, but I guess there was probably quite a lot of capacity building, but they're relatively simple devices to use. And they give, I mean, what I was told was that they give the farmers confidence that there's still moisture in the soil, and therefore they don't need to irrigate, and therefore they save water. And if they can, I mean, the wetting front detector is just like a flag that goes up and tells them that they need to irrigate or whatever when it dries out to a sufficient degree. And I mean, I guess they have experience because they can see that, you know, when they follow that advice, as it were, then they still get a good crop. And the other encouraging thing I heard was also, and I can't remember any of the details, it may have been rather anecdotal, but there was some evidence, I think, that farmers were talking to other farmers who didn't have this device, and actually those other farmers were then basing their scheduling on the information that they were being provided by the farmers that did have the device. So I think that, you know, there was an element of community doing like that as well. And I should also, sorry.
Yeah, if it's okay, I might use this as an opportunity to mention a bit about crop water budgeting, and Richu may want to add, because as you're probably quite aware, one of the tricky things is all these things that can make water more productive, including what you're talking about of, okay, not putting on too much water, or even switching to drip irrigation. And similarly with solar power, there are things that can be great for individual farmers, saving time, getting more produce or so on, but can actually make it more profitable to pump water out of the aquifer. And so part of the challenge and the opportunity for a Nexus approach is to think about, okay, how do we balance and find synergies and ways to build a consensus on balancing, okay, how much water is available and how much water do people take out of the ground? And I don't know the specifics about that surface water case in Ethiopia, but what's quite interesting in the work in India is this crop water budgeting of bringing in outside scientific information, again, like these sensors of, okay, what's the recharge rate? What's down there in the aquifer? What crops are you thinking about growing? What does that mean for the total amount of water needed? And then having a discussion as a community of, okay, what are our priorities? What do we want to do? And maybe Richu wants to add some more about that as a tool that can be combined with other tools.
Yes, so like Ruth said earlier, so as a facilitators, we use community resource persons, and these people are, from the same villages, probably from where the intervention is happening. And so they are given the capacity on how to use the tools. And the other aspect is how the tools are also designed by keeping in mind, how easily the community can use it. So that is why I was emphasizing on, we use a lot of pictorial depiction of a weighing scale. So if there is a water deficit, it will be tilted towards the right. So these kind of, pictorial depiction is used to communicate the data. And the other thing is that also the implementation of the tool, that is also happening with community engagement. So we sit with the community. Some of the information like, secondary data sources are also coming in. But other than that, a majority of the input data also comes from sitting with the community and talking about what are the crops you're growing, how much water, how much irrigation do you require. So these kind of, data is coming from the community in itself. And then you're collectively arriving at how much water is available to you. So now when this data, when it's presented to you, and the community also thinks about, okay, this is our crop choice, current crop choice, and is it enough for, is it exceeding the water that is available to us? So this kind of discussion in the community. So the idea is it's a collectively, you have to sit with the community, it's a collective process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think actually this leads to a very good point that Marie-Charlotte Buisson has made in the Q&A about the rather a comment, but I want to highlight the essential role of the context, hydrology, socioeconomic characteristics of the community, agricultural value chains, water markets, and all for upscaling. And that's part of what we've been wrestling with in trying to, we aren't going to be able to develop one standard toolbox. In fact, in some of the discussions with Brian, I said, it's not so much a toolbox, but think of it as a catalog of tools. My husband happens to like looking at tool catalogs and such. And then you think about, okay, for my particular area, it might take a combination of this and this and this. But that combination, and you have to have somebody who understands that context to know which combinations might work, and a lot of muddling through rather than being prescriptive that there's one thing just because this worked for FES, and even FES will say, Ritu said, it worked differently in Rajasthan versus Madhya Pradesh. And so you absolutely have to take account of the context. I would even add the socioeconomic context in terms of the likelihood of cooperation among within the group of farmers and more broadly, some of those kinds of things. What I would also say is that just information by itself will not succeed. Just regulation by itself will not succeed, and even games by themselves will not succeed. It requires a combinations and people drawing from different approaches. But we had a lot of rich discussion in the workshop about how do we capture the experiences of this. And it's important to capture not only the experiences of what works, but what didn't work and what are the limitations of this. Because otherwise you get some, a false sense that, oh, it worked in this particular village, and so it will work everywhere. You need to understand the context under which it worked, and you need to understand contexts under which these things don't work, and getting at some of those issues. So it's a really complex set of issues. We are in our last minute. I'd like to, and I don't see many new questions coming up. I'd like to turn this to Brian and then Ritu to give us any last thoughts.
Ritu?
Yeah, so like Ruth said, like there's a lot of things that when you implement the tools, a lot of things have to be paid attention to. For example, the capacity building of the facilitators who are doing this, and so their conceptual clarity and how they can conduct it. So a lot of things also depends on that. So for that, you also require some intensive capacity building approaches to ensure that we have this people who can actually talk about water, who can facilitate a discussion around water. So these kind of things is some of the challenges that we also faced initially, and we have maneuvered around it and come up with our own solutions. And also, yeah, like we said, the resource context is important, the socio-ecological context is important. So all these things have to be taken into account, and yeah, when we think about any sort of interventions.
Okay, and I'll just kind of add quickly again the opportunities for the Nexus to go beyond some of what's been done before. So that yes, solar power for pumping is great, and selling electricity to the grid is a neat opportunity. Fine, okay, what else may be needed to get the resource in balance? Again, groundwater has great opportunities for storage and managing it, but that needs governance, and not just to sacrifice ecosystems, but to be much more aware of their value and bring people together to consider, what are the trade-offs, what are the synergies, what are the opportunities if we include groundwater dependent ecosystems and environmental flows, including also what people are using for their domestic water as part of the considerations in working together. So these are some of the opportunities the Nexus approach opens up and raises questions to address. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all very much. And please feel free to follow up with us if you want the framework paper and some of the resources that Ritu also has mentioned. We're very pleased to share this. And thank you to the NEXUS Gains organizers.